I'm Christy, and it's time for another Wargame Soldiers and Strategy painting tutorial. This week we're going to be looking at how you can paint a very specific color, one that's given its share of miniature painters and army builders plenty of fits, I'd say. It's beloved by fashionistas and goth kids alike, and of course the color I mean here is black. And for such a really basic and ubiquitous color that really appears everywhere, it seems that it's actually really hard to deal with when you're painting your miniatures. Now, of course, it's also pretty hard to avoid because almost all miniature figures have some amount of black on them somewhere, some accent, some detail, whether it's a belt or shoes or a bag. It's really hard to avoid painting black. Now, with such small accessories, it's usually not that hard. You can just sort of slap on some black paint, highlight it with some gray colors, and you're done. And heck, I even did that in my last video, and in those cases it works really well. But then what do you do when you've got a miniature that's got really a lot of black on it? Like a black uniform, and black accessories, and a black hat, and who knows what else. But a figure where there's a lot of black, well, that's a whole different story. How do you keep your figure from looking kind of flat and uninteresting and unrealistic? And if you apply that technique that I just mentioned with the black and gray, that's exactly what you're going to get. So really, how can you solve that problem? How can you end up with a figure that has a lot of black on it but still has visually very distinct areas of color and that appears realistic? Well, that's what we're going to look at in this video. So obviously, if we're going to talk about painting a figure with a lot of black on it, we first have to come up with a figure that, well, has a lot of black on it. There are a variety of obvious choices in historical figures that would be well suited to this purpose. For example, ninjas would have been a really great demonstration of how to paint a lot of black. But I thought maybe, especially since my last video was already sort of about Japanese theme, that we didn't probably want to do any more things from the Japanese theme, even though I have actually had quite a lot of experience painting ninjas for a recent demo game that I did. But there are thankfully other options when it comes to a lot of black, like this fellow here, and he hails from the Napoleonic era, and he is another very famous example of a unit that wore a lot of black. A lot of you probably recognize who this is going to be already. He is one of the famous black Brunswickers, and this particular fellow is from the Lieb Battalion. And you probably may or may not know, during the Napoleonic era there was a variety of small sort of princes and dukedoms that sort of divided Germany, and a lot of them were involved in the Napoleonic Wars, and there was a great variety in their uniforms, a lot of diversity, regional diversity in uniforms in that area. But Brunswick was particularly famous because they decided to dress very strikingly many of their men in an almost totally black uniform, and that's still very famous today because, you know, it was sort of, I don't know, maybe it was remarkable for the time. I guess it must have been unusual. So even today they're often remembered, and this particular figure is from the Perry Napoleonic range. They do a whole series of Brunswickers, including ones that are marching and shooting, and they have also a command pack, and this guy's from the command pack. You can see he's a drummer. So I'm going to use him as a way sort of demonstrating how you can handle figures that have lots and lots of black on them in different places and on different parts of their equipment. So the first step with something like this is really sort of identifying all of the different areas that are going to be black on him, because, you know, a guy like this, especially sort of a Napoleonic era soldier or something comparable, they have a pretty complicated uniform. They've got a lot of kit, a lot of different equipment. They're not like that unarmored samurai we painted last time. So you have to really, before you start, you have to plan a little bit and maybe research, figure out what colors different elements of the uniform need to be, and, you know, think about that accordingly. So the way that we're going to approach this is I've decided to work with a foundry tried again. We introduced it in my last video. It's charcoal black. But of course the trick is going to be we're not going to just apply this straight onto all areas of his uniform. We're going to sort of add tones to it to create different types of black and sort of differentiate between the different areas. You can see I've actually already done some work on this figure. He's been already cleaned up and base coated with gray enamel. I know last time I said I often use black enamel for my undercoat, and normally I do, but this figure I prepared him quite some time ago for another project that never quite got off the ground, and that was kind of before I started using black all the time. But I think in some ways it'll be better for this video, because if I'd used a black undercoat, it would have been really hard for you to see what I was doing and what areas I was painting black, and I think it just would have made it a lot harder to see, since this tutorial is actually about black. You can see also I've already painted his skin and flesh, and that's because this tutorial really isn't about painting skin. I talked about that a lot in my last video, and I basically used exactly the same technique, the same paints here. The only difference is, but in that video I used sort of an improvised Asian flesh triad that I put together out of foundry colors. In this case, I just used the standard foundry flesh triad that you can just sort of buy as a pack, and I just applied that to him, and then otherwise I used exactly the same kind of colors for the shadows and the washes and stuff. And I painted his hair and mustache too, and I just do that with some sort of Vallejo colors I had laying around very quickly. I think I painted it sort of leather brown, and then I washed it with I'm trying to remember, I think Agrax Earth Shade, and then when it was dry I took some saddle brown and added a little kind of creamy white to that and added that as a highlight. But it's not very precise, and because of the way he's dressed and his uniform, you really don't see very much of his hair, so it's not something you really need to focus on very much. So, as I said, you need to start by identifying the different areas of black that you're going to paint and, you know, sort of differentiating them. And the first one that I've identified in this figure is going to be his uniform and his shako, which are obviously the largest, most primary parts of this whole figure. And it's going to cover the most space. And those areas are black with their fabric, their black fabric. So what I want to do is find a way to show that it's black fabric, but also give it sort of a tone, because if you kind of think about black fabric for a moment, especially sort of when it's highlighted, where it's highlighted, or where the light hits it, it tends to sort of develop other sort of tones. Or I mean, you will see in reflections of that color, you'll often see different colors appear, sort of, if you look carefully, because, you know, especially when it comes to dyes for fabrics, there's a lot of variety and consistency, and depending on, you know, what substance was used in the dye, other colors will, you know, creep in. So I've decided for the fabric on this guy, I'm going to add in a blue to my black, and I'm using the French blue light from Foundry here, and this will give it an ever so subtle cast, that fabric, because I think blue really complements black really, really nicely. If you're trying to make a slight tone on black, they really go together and it looks nice. There's other colors that would look great too. You could use purples or reds, but I think blue is a really great complement to black. So what I'm going to do is now that I've got out the darkest shade color, which is I think really true black, I'm going to take some of this here blue, and I'm going to add it in to the black, and I'm going to mix it in. And you can see it's actually turned very blue there, probably bluer than I want. The trick with making sort of a tone of black like this is that you want to add enough of the other color so you can see that it's a distinct shade, but you don't want to add so much of the color that it starts to look more like that color than your black. So I just added in some more black here, as you can see real quick, to tone that down, because that was coming across as too blue, I thought. So now I've got a shade that I think is a lot more pleasing. It's got, you can definitely see that there's a hint of something else in there, but it's not so overwhelming, you know, as to really completely take away that this is supposed to be a black uniform. So I'm just going to begin by base coating this guy in this dark color that I've mixed, and I'm going to apply that to all these areas of clothing and to a shako, as I discussed. And once I've finished doing that, then I will move on and do a similar thing with the other two shades in this triad. So I will add in blue to the medium color, and I'll apply that onto his clothing, and then I will do the same to the light color, and I will apply that onto his clothing. And then after I've done that, I'll take a look and sort of evaluate and see where I need to be going from there, basically. So now I've finished applying the shade color, sort of the medium color, and the sort of highlight color to the entire figure. And I've come to a certain, I came to a certain realization pretty quickly that the medium color was really, for black that I want, is really just too light to use as the medium color. And if I'd proceeded in that way, I would have ended up with more of a gray uniform than I wanted. So I ended up actually shifting a little bit, and I ended up making the medium color by mixing the charcoal black medium with some of the black from the shade color, and then making the highlight color just the actual medium color, if that makes sense, because I thought it would just be too light otherwise. So now what I need to do is I kind of need to look at this figure. I kind of need to evaluate how it came out, and that's what you always have to do with these sorts of colors like black and white and stuff. You always have to be checking in them to see if they're going the right way, if they're too much a color that you don't want them to be. And this figure, you can see he definitely he's developed a blue cast, and the question is, you have to really think if it's too much of a blue cast. That's what you have to be critical of, and I don't know, and I'm a little bit on the fence about this right now, but whatever the case, whether you think it's just right, or if you know for sure that you went too far and it really just looks too blue to you, don't panic. There is a way to fix this, and that is to use a wash, a black wash on the figure, a light black wash, I might add, because you really don't want to overdo it. But what this will do is it will bring a certain unity to the figure, and sort of, underscore that it is actually black, and it will tone down all the blue or any of the sort of other color you've got in there without, completely removing it, especially if you keep the wash light. So I've decided I'm just going to apply this sort of black wash, which is Nuln Oil. It's a Citadel color, all over my model very carefully and not too heavily. The other nice thing about doing this is it will flow down into all the sort of the cracks and crevices of the model, and that'll add extra sort of contrast in those areas, which I think will be nice. If you're going to do this, of course, the problem you can get with washes like this is you can risk getting your figure to be a little bit muddy looking with washes. They remove sort of the crispness of color, which is, that's not always what you want. So you need to think about that when you're doing this. So I've already applied, the first three colors, the shadow, the medium color, and the base to this figure. What I decided was the shadow, the medium, and the base. And then at that point you want to evaluate, because as you may have noticed from my other video, I'm a big fan of, after doing the normal 3 shades, of then making sort of a lining color and adding that last toward the high layers, the really sharp creases in the fabric and the edges of clothing and stuff, to really make the figure pop. And my experience is that if you're going to do this wash step, do your normal 3 colors, then apply the wash, let it dry, or as somebody pointed out to me, you can also use a hairdryer if you're impatient and you're a little bit careful at that point. But let that dry, and then after that's done, go ahead and apply that really high highlight color, that lining color, if you're going to do it, and that will help sort of restore some crispness to your colors and not sort of leave the sort of finished impression that the figure is extremely muddy. So now the wash is all dry, and per the tip I got, I actually did try using a hairdryer on the figure to get the wash dry quickly, and that did really work really well. As long as you don't turn your hairdryer too high and really sort of start blowing it around on the surface of the figure, you should be okay. So now that I've done that, I'm going to start applying the really high highlight edging color, which for that I'm just using what would be the normal light color in this triad, to which I've added some blue, because as I said, the normal range, otherwise it would have just been too light. And as you'd expect, I'm applying that to really, high creases in the fabric and the like, onto knees, elbows, edges of fabric. He's got sort of a button, his jacket sort of buttons in the front, sort of a dolman style jacket, I think that's called, if I'm right. And those are the areas are really sort of, that sort of banding is black too, but it sticks up pretty high. So I'm gonna be applying this high highlight color to that as well. So now I've finished, I've gone all over the areas that I wanted to edge with that lightest sort of edge color, and that sort of brings back a little bit of that blue that might have been dulled by the wash in certain, key areas, because the place you're going to see these sort of tones most is actually in the high highlight areas, and that's how you want it to be. So that more or less sort of finishes off the cloth area of this guy's uniform. So now we can move on to sort of a second black region, distinct black region, and we're going to use the charcoal black as a base again, but this time the area we're going to be looking at is a certain amount of his equipment. He's got a lot of leather things that he's wearing, like for example here his backpack, this was black, his shoes, the brim of his shako are all going to be leather, and the black leather. So I want, but I want that to still be a distinct shade of black from what he has on his clothing. And, leather, I mean, normally it's going to be brown, but so if it was black, it was kind of dyed black. So we kind of want to assume that there's going to be sort of that warm brown leather tone is still going to kind of be in the black on the leather. And especially, around the edges, it may show through even more, where there's been some wear. Let's see, I think actually also I'll probably do his scabbard as well in this color, this red black brown color. So I need to find a suitable kind of color for that. So let me see. I've got some handy Vallejo colors here. I know I've used them less, but they're right at hand and they're about right. So I have this here, I have this Vallejo, it's a saddle brown color. So I'm going to go back and basically repeat exactly the same process that I just did on the clothing, but this time I'm going to, instead of mixing in that French blue color, I am going to mix in some of the saddle brown color into my black, and the result you're going to see is you're going to get it's kind of hard to see on the camera because it's such a subtle difference, but you can see here what you're instantly getting is a much warmer shade of black, and you can, because of the brown, the way it tints the black is not so heavy as with the blue. You can kind of get away with, it seems, with mixing a bit more of it into the black paint and not, making it look too harsh. So I'm now going to apply this reddish black color to these leather areas that I just identified as going to be sort of being this sort of leather color. So now that I've applied sort of the 3 shades to those leather areas I discussed, I'm going to go back and sort of apply a little extra weathering to the edge with just the pure saddle brown. But of course you don't want it to be very thick, because otherwise, you know, you'll look too brown. But, you know, especially sort of on his shoes, around the edges of his backpack, since we know this is leather and we know the leather has been dyed, we would kind of expect areas sort of to scuff or wear, and then the dye would kind of rub off a little bit and would show through. So what we can do is we can take the pure saddle brown and, you know, thin it quite a bit so it's pretty transparent, because compared to the black, it's still quite a bit stronger color, and it won't take a very strong amount of it to really show up on the black. And then just apply it places very carefully, like the tops of the shoes and here sort of around the very edge, the edge of the backpack flap, which you would expect sort of naturally to wear, and then you would get sort of brown. You can kind of, if you want to, you can, when you apply it, you can kind of do it sort of very carefully by making like very tiny little dots with the tip of your brush, and sort of working in from the edge, making little tiny dots of it, and that will give it sort of that sort of uneven sort of wear effect, like it was handled in those places, and that will look nice and natural in the figure. So now that we've done that, we're kind of going to move on to a third area of black I've identified, which is also leather, and it's just different. I just want to contrast with those areas of leather, and that's the sort of his straps, all his strapping. And he's got quite a bit of strapping for his drone and for his bags and for his backpack. And I mean, yeah, I could make it that. I did the same thing I did just now with those bags, but I want that to be a third sort of, I want that to contrast again. And I've already decided that I'm just going to use the flat sort of normal charcoal black triad for that. I'm not going to add in any special colors to it. And I'm not even going to worry about sort of having to create or sort of darken the middle shade down, because these areas are so thin and so small that you're not really going to see very much blending or anything, and you actually probably want it to appear maybe a little lighter, a little bit more gray on those strap areas, sort of to emphasize them. So now that I've applied just the straight gray to the straps, I've taken some sort of, Vallejo light gray, and I've mixed it into the lightest shade of the charcoal gray, and I'm using that to apply edge highlights to the straps, because, well, the straps are just, because they're just the way that they're sort of on top of everything else, you really want to try and draw, if you can, you want to try and draw some extra attention to them and really make them pop out of the rest. So I'm very lightly edging it in this color. And then what I'm going to take, I've got next to it sort of just the straight light gray color, which would, for black, under normal circumstances for painting black, would really just be way too light. But when you're doing these sort of highlighted straps, it isn't. It just looks like you've got sort of a very shiny surface there going on. So we're going to move on now to the final black area, which is going to be the plume on his hat, or on his shako. This, I think, is horsehair, and so I don't know. I think I want it to be a slightly different shade than the other areas. And if you look at a black horse, they're really pretty and they're really shiny, but sort of you'll see their coat often if they're healthy. It really reflects the light and it really glistens. And you know, you see it. There's a lot of colors sort of in their hair. So I want to choose it sort of like one more sort of variant of black to do this plume with. And I think the color that I'm going to use, I'm going to use purple for that. Purple is another color that goes and coordinates pretty well with black, in my experience. This is a Foundry Royal Purple, from the Royal Purple Triad, that is, and this is the Royal Purple shade color. So, same drill. I'm going to get out the black, the darkest dark, and I'm going to add purple into it. And actually I'm going to add a fairly large amount of purple because this area is going to be pretty, it's really just sort of an accent area on the costume. So it won't, I don't think it'll be too overwhelming if I have this with a bit more purple in it than I might otherwise. So what I ended up doing on the plume in the end was I painted on the base color all over. Then I took the medium charcoal gray and I added some purple to that, and I sort of just used that with the tip of my brush to highlight the tops of the hair tufts. And that worked pretty well, but at that point I decided it needed to be, the whole thing just sort of needed some unity that it was lacking, so I just washed the whole thing with Nuln oil, that's, you know, a Citadel wash, in order to bring it together and also to get a higher contrast between the tops of the sort of hair tufts and the sort of cracks. And that helps. So now what I'm doing, I'm just going back over, and I've taken the medium charcoal gray. I've added extra purple to it, just a little bit, and just a hint of Vallejo light gray. And I am sort of putting an extra highlight, not on the whole length of the tufts, but just sort of on the tops of the tufts. So at this point, I'm working on some areas of his costume that would have been just sort of a gray color, kind of I don't know, sort of a medium to light gray color. And I really kind of figured there's kind of two areas that I think would be sort of a medium gray tone. And those are going to be, he's got sort of an apron on, which is something that drummers at this period often wore, just sort of an apron, and it was, I don't know, it was leather or it was canvas, I'm not sure, but the purpose of that was to sort of protect your clothing, probably from getting banged up by the drum you were carrying, because I suppose when you're walking along it's banging against your legs all day, it kind of it probably tends to wear. So that I'm going to paint that sort of a medium gray color, and I'm going to give that same, I'm giving that same treatment to his bedroll, which I sort of is also sort of a grayish colored fabric. So I'm back now and I'm working on sort of the blue elements of the uniform. I've sort of made up my own triad for this, which I used the Foundry Deep Blue Light as the base color, and then I'm going to use this Tomb Blue Dark as the medium color, and the Tomb Blue Light as the highlight, or Tomb Blue Regular, sorry, as the highlight color. Aside from the black, there's actually a lot of blue in this figure, and the Live Regiment used this sort of very I don't know what you call it, cerulean blue. It's really cyan almost, as their sort of their trim color on their uniforms. So that's what I'm doing. I had to go check really quick some details on the uniform, at which point I actually realized that the helmet, the straps and the bands on the helmet were in fact also black, which I hadn't realized to begin with. So I've also gone back in and painted the straps on the helmet, and I've just used the standard charcoal gray triad to do that, like I have on all the other straps. It didn't take very long. I should have guessed probably that was actually going to be black as well, but I almost thought there can be more black. Surely this is just going to be metal braid or something, but I was wrong. It was in fact black as well. Alright, so I've completely finished highlighting or painting the blue now all over the uniform. And I was right, as I predicted, that high highlight, the tomb blue medium was sufficient, and I don't feel like I'm going to need to highlight it any further. I'm not going to have to put a higher edge highlight onto the blue areas. The other thing I did, which I didn't really talk about, but while I was busy, I painted the drum, the skin of the drum, and I did that using Boneyard, starting from the darkest Boneyard color in the Foundry Triad up to white, and I applied that on the drum head with sort of a stippling technique, lots of little dots, and that gives the drum skin sort of that stretched, kind of beaten look that you kind of get sometimes on those drum skins after they've been, pounded on for a while, if you kind of look at a drum head. So I didn't really discuss that, but it's a pretty easy technique. You really just start with the darkest color and you leave it and you work towards the center, gradually bringing the sort of lightest white area in the center of the drum and then darker kind of around the edges to provide sort of some shading. So I thought the other thing I would do real quick before I move on is really point out all the areas that are blue on this model, because I didn't really do that before, and there are quite a few. The drum itself, for one, as I mentioned, that's sort of my choice to paint it blue. The body of the drum blue is based on what a reenactment group I found online had done with theirs. Another area, there's blue piping down the sides of the pants. I don't know, you can kind of see, I guess you can kind of see that there. See, they've got sort of a blue stripe. His water bottle is also blue, his canteen. It seems to be made out of wood, but from what I've seen in references, it's often painted blue. He's got he's got blue cuffs on his sleeves as well, and because he's a drummer, he has sort of blue lacing on his shoulders. I had to look this up a little bit carefully, because a lot of times you'll see drummers tend to actually will have sort of reversed colors of their regiment, the battalion, or whatever. It'll actually be reversed from what they normally would be. But after I looked this up, it seems that they did not do that. The Leib battalion did not do that, apparently. They just had blue braiding on their shoulders. And then also he has a blue collar as well. So those are all areas you need to think about painting blue on this guy. There's actually quite a lot, but it makes a really pretty accent for the black, and I think, considering that we sort of worked some blue into the black fabric, I think that was a really good choice. So what do we have left to do? Well, there's just a lot of little detail work, basically, but I'm going to move on now to painting the white areas on this model, and I want them to have sort of a creamy base to them. I want it to be sort of a creamy white, so I'm going to use Boneyard Medium as a base and Boneyard Light, and then just pure white as a highlight. In the areas that he's got, which are going to be white, he's got this sort of he's got a sort of a, I don't know, I guess it's sort of a provisions bag. I think they kept food and that sort of thing in these bags, and that bag seems to have been white, so I'm going to apply that. I'm going to paint that bag white, start with the medium Boneyard and work up, as I said. The other areas that I'm going to go over and paint white at this point are, he has blue cuffs, but he has a sort of a white piping around the tops of his cuffs. So that's going to be painted this color as well. And the other area is on the drum, the strings, the tensioning strings on the drum are also kind of a white color. So I'm going to go and paint all of those areas with this and make sort of a creamy white color out of all of those areas. So now that I've finished the white, I'm going to move on to applying some stripes to the drum, because it appears, almost all the examples of this drum I've seen, the around the rim, there's sort of these diagonal stripes. Well, not diagonal, but sort of like they're stripes, but they're kind of like at an angle. So I'm going to go ahead and apply those, and they're yellow. So the color I'm using to do this, I am going to use the Foundry ochre triad for this. So now I've finished painting the 3 shades of yellow onto the stripes on the drum. And another thing I've done, there's sort of these hold down pieces that sort of hold the strings in place on the drum, and I've just gone ahead and painted them with the basic charcoal black triad, all 3 straight shades. I mean, this is one thing you have to keep in mind. I knew from the beginning that these were going to have to be black, but I didn't paint them at the same time as everything else that I painted black, or the other straps, because I knew that it would be very difficult if I painted them first to be able to handle the drum body and then the strings without, making a mess. And sometimes you just have to have these concessions, you want to paint all a certain shade of black or a color at once, but sometimes you just can't, because there's just, it would just be too difficult, and it's just easier to wait, honestly. So that's what I've done in this case. So at this point, there's really very little left to do at this point. We've done most of the major things. There's just a few detail things, which include sort of metal accents and the drumsticks. So I'm going to paint the drumsticks first, and I am going to use, I have this, I could get a triad out, but honestly, I'm just going to use what I've got laying around. I've got this, I've got this sort of leather brown, this Vallejo leather brown laying here, so I'm going to shake that up really good, and I'm just going to use it, honestly. So I've now finished up the wood, once again, just with really a combination of things I had laying around. As I said, I used leather brown sort of as a base, and then I took that phthalo brown I already had that I'd been using sort of to mix in my black. I used that as a medium shade, and then I took that Foundry ochre shade color, and I used that as a highlight, because I like sort of a nice warm wood color, and it's nice because the ochre actually sort of works with the yellow stripe on the drum already, and sometimes it sort of, you get this sort of nice washed out highlight on the wood, which I think looks pretty good in this case. So the only thing that we now have really left to do is to deal with the metal. So then I just have to find some metal colors that are good. There's a very small amount of sort of brass on this figure, and a very small amount of sort of silver or steel, or however you want to think of it. So I'm going to do the steel parts first. Let's see if I can find a good color here. I use Vallejo or metal colors at this point, mostly because I feel like I don't have any choice. I don't really like them because I think the pigment, I don't feel like it's very concentrated. I don't think they're very great, and I'm looking into alternatives at the moment. I'm thinking about trying some of the new Citadel metallics, but I haven't got around to getting any yet, so I'm still kind of stuck with the Foundry ones for the moment. So I'm taking, or if not Foundry, I mean the Vallejo one. So I'm taking natural steel here, and I've thinned it down a little bit. But that's the thing with these Vallejo metallics. They're annoying because they're very thick out of the bottle and hard to apply. But if you it tends to be the case, I found at least, that when you thin them down enough so that, you know, they flow smoothly, then the pigment loses a lot of its concentration, which is incredibly annoying. So the areas that are steel on this, they're not very many. It's mostly the his buttons on the front. He has sort of buttons on the front of his coat, and those are going to be metal. At least they appear to be metal. And then the other area is, of course, he has this death's head emblem on his shako, and that is a shiny silver metal color, sort of an emblem. So I'm going to get that. I'm going to hit that really quickly with the metal. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and get the sort of brass metallic colors ready, and I'm going to use a Vallejo bronze as the base for these. And the areas that are bronze on this, he's got on the front of his straps, he's got this, which is sort of a brass piece, and that's sort of a holder for his drumsticks when he's not using them, I think. And I'm going to give that a base coat in the bronze. I'm going to make it, of course, shinier later. And the other area that is bronze on this guy is on his sword and scabbard. Okay. Now I'm going to, the silver, or the areas, I'm going to, especially the emblem, I'm going to give it a wash of black because I want more shadow there down in the recesses on that. The buttons, that's not so horribly critical, I don't think, but I'm still going to do it. And brass, well, I'm not going to wash it with black because that would be really too cool a color and it wouldn't look good. But I think, let's see, I will wash it as well, but I will use Agrex Earthshade on it because that is a warmer color and it'll work better. Alright, so it didn't really take very long for the wash on those metal bits to dry because they were really small. So then I immediately went in and highlighted them. I highlighted the brass areas using Vallejo gold, and I highlighted the silver sort of metal plated areas using Vallejo silver. Pretty basic, and that was once again just the sword, the scabbard and sword fittings, and the drumstick holder was the brass color, and the skull, death's head emblem, the buttons were the silver color, and that, I think, pretty much does it for this figure. I think we're almost done. We're pretty close to done. I don't think there is much else left to do. I think we've painted pretty much everything on this guy. So I hope that you found this to be a helpful tutorial, that maybe you got some ideas about how you can paint blacks on a figure like this where there's a lot of black, but you still want the elements to remain distinct and different from one another, and how you can using standard base color, the charcoal black in this case, but by adding in different tints you can sort of create distinct areas that are slightly different tones of the same color, and in such a way create a figure that is more visually interesting than if you had just used one color. And I know my techniques are maybe a little too time consuming for a lot of you, especially if you plan to paint a lot of Napoleonic figures, because gosh knows they're really a lot of trouble. But I think that at least the techniques I used for the black on this figure are not too time consuming, and you can easily sort of adapt those, I think, to a speedier painting style, either by cutting out the number of shades or levels you use, but then still mixing in the tint, or, you know, just sort of not being so detailed as I was on this figure. So let me know what you think in the comments for this video. If you thought this was a good tutorial, a bad tutorial. Let me know what else you want to see, what you want to see next, if there's other periods, other figures you'd like me to see paint, or sort of concepts or, you know, techniques that you'd like me to try and cover. And I will try to do that. And, you know, also like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and, well, I will see you next time on the War Game Soldiers and Strategy painting guide series.